So I think you've figured out by now that our technology is gone to heaven. Yeah. So all throughout the fall, we've been reading the Beatitudes, and this is the culmination of the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes, the word means blessing, and it's the preface and maybe even the summation of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew is really, those 3 chapters, if you want to know what the historical Jesus taught and what he was all about, that's them. And if you read it deeply, even superficially, you'll soon find that sometimes the Jesus we think we know is not the Jesus of the text. The Beatitudes are heavy. It isn't light reading. I was recently visiting someone in jail, and while they were in jail, they were decided that they would read the Bible, and they started with Matthew. Wrong choice. And the person was able to articulate it. I'm not getting a lot of comfort out of this Jesus. So I recommended beginning with John, which is written in a little different flavor. These Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, is a heavy lift. It's why that the church historically has not really focused on it, which is odd if you think about it. I mean, here it is in 3 chapters, kind of the summation of what Jesus was all about. And yet the church doesn't really focus on these teachings. Throughout this autumn, we have seen that these teachings are not flimsy things. They're not moralisms, and they're not think positive maxims that help guide our day. They're deeper than that. The blessings of Jesus are similar to his call. Follow me. And when we ask, follow you where, Jesus? He says what? Where's he going? Where's Jesus going? Take a guess. To the cross. To death. In our time, to treason. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran theologian who himself was a martyr of the faith, said, when Christ calls us, he bids us come and die with me. To be religious, to be Christian, is actually pretty easy. To follow Jesus, to make the Beatitudes part of your life, that's hard. The road of religion is wide. The path that Jesus asks us to follow is narrow. We work out our salvation with fear and trembling. It's a heavy message. Tom Fox heard Christ's call and found himself on the path of the Beatitudes. Tom was just an ordinary guy who responded to the events of 9/11 way long ago with an extraordinary, rare, and powerful love that emerged from within him. He entered into deeper darkness during that time. He volunteered to become part of what is called a Christian Peacemaker team. The CPT, Christian Peacemaker Team, is an international organization, and it is set up to support peace workers who go into deeply conflicted areas around the world. They're kind of like our Marines, our special forces of the Christian faith. These teams following Jesus' instructions in the Beatitudes, what they believe is that we can lower levels of hostility and violence through nonviolent direct action, through the documentation of human rights and their abuses, and make them known publicly, and through nonviolent training. Tom said, quote, I had a clear sense that I wanted very much to find some way to pull us out of the darkness and move the world, even if it was the movement of one human being toward the light. And again, to take us back to 9/11, you'll remember the whole nation was in war frenzy. Flags everywhere, chants everywhere. As a Christian peacemaker, Tom first served in the West Bank, protesting the separation wall, planting olive trees, interviewing Palestinians whose homes were destroyed, being present as light in the darkness. And then he transferred to Iraq after the effects of shock and awe. And he continued his ministry of presence. He would accompany refugees. He would accompany shipments of medicine to the poor. He would interview incarcerated Iraqis. He would assist their families. And his team would work with Muslim peacemaker teams. All of this going on while civil war was breaking out all over Iraq. In November 2005, Tom and 3 other members of his team were abducted off of the streets of Baghdad, and they were held for 118 days as hostages. The 3 were eventually rescued, but Tom was martyred with shotgun wounds through his head and his chest. This is the hard ground of the good news of Jesus Christ. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. This is the fear and trembling in the deep regions of our faith. The Beatitude is asking us, who will show and tell the world that love is willing to pay the price that restores harmony and wholeness and the hope that has been given despite the disruption and the brokenness and the violation of the people of this world? Who will show and tell the world that grace, given freely, nevertheless does have a cost, that it can cost the giver her very life? The Beatitude, all of the Beatitudes, cause us to ask, where does one go to be trained in such skills that are required if we are to love fiercely and give up fear as a way of life? Tom Fox was simply an ordinary guy. He was trained in the ordinary ways of the Quaker faith. Now, George Fox, way back in 1640s, he was the John Wesley of the Quaker faith. He once said, "I saw that there was an ocean of darkness and death in the world, but also an infinite ocean of light and love, which flowed over the ocean of darkness. And in that I saw the infinite love of God, and I had great openings." Tom's great opening came after years of spiritual training in the consciousness and the teachings of Jesus. He was shaped by his faith, itself shaped by a whole congregation of others striving to follow Jesus. And the good news that we have here in Lake Washington, the good news that we have to offer our neighbors, is that we focus on developing within ourselves the spiritual consciousness of Jesus. We offer training in the ways that restore relationships, training that gives birth to a culture of sacred wisdom, which is an alternative to this present apocalyptic time in which we are living, in which we are always afraid. Tom's opening came after years of preparation. It's similar to when Kathy discovered that Mike and then Andy was growing within her. She immediately went into nesting mode. A room had to be prepared for the coming child. Items like clothes and cribs and toys all had to be assembled. The coming birth of our children brought Kathy and I into deeper, more intimate conversation about parenting and marriage and our own values and our own thoughts about the future. In the 9-month period of waiting, we prepared to greet our child into the world with joy and security, a security of home and of gifts in which they could use and develop. It's the same in the Christian faith. We are preparing for new birth. Tom was prepared for his great opening through his years of being a follower of Jesus, taking seriously the Sermon on the Mount, taking seriously Jesus' hard teachings, even with the soft, taking seriously the wisdom of the faith that teaches us how to live our daily life, but also how to live in the face of the powers that want to dominate us. Today is called Christ the King Sunday. It is a day when the global church celebrates Christ's victory over the powers of sin and death. But what is that victory? How do you and I, ordinary people, experience that victory in our own lives? If Christ calls us to follow him to the cross, what is the cost of such discipleship? Will it be like Tom Fox, the cost of our very own mortality? Will it be the death of our ego, of our pride, of our addictions, of our status, of our fears, of our hurts? What dies when Christ is given birth within us? That's a two-pronged message of the teachings of Jesus. On the front cover of your bulletin is a picture of James Loney. He was a friend of Tom Fox, and one of those held with him as a hostage. He survived, and he gave us insight, and I put this on the cover of the bulletin because this is the take-home. I think this reflection on his time as a hostage and his reflection on being a Christian is well worth paying attention to throughout this week. He said, "This is what I think I've learned, though I make no claims about successfully living it. We're born to be born. Again and again, every day and every moment, in every decision, big or small, regardless of where we are or what is happening to us. We were given birth to give birth, and every body is holy. The hardest birth of all is dying. The labor pains will seize us. We'll have no control over the time or place. Our job is to allow God to breathe us through, together in the mystery of incarnation and peace, the birthright, the manger and swaddling clothes of every human being, announced by angel voices that say, 'Do not be afraid. This peace I have come to cherish as the dearest and most essential of all things.'" He's an interesting guy to Google and to look into what has happened in his life. Next week, we will enter the season of Advent. As Stephanie was saying, it's a 4-week time of preparing our own hearts to receive the birth of the Christ child yet again, And so often we think of this as sentimental. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need comfort. But what does it mean to literally receive the Christ into your life? And if Christ is in your life, how does that change us? Advent is a time of training, preparing us to be open to the Holy Spirit, like Mary was open to the Holy Spirit's invitation to birth within us the spiritual consciousness and pattern of Jesus' life throughout all of our relationships. Those of us who are parents know that when we have a child, it changes us. It changes our lifestyle. It changes how we treat others. It changes how we react to circumstances and situations. It's the same way with the birth of Christ. And the gift of the church in the season of Advent is to remind us that that birth is ever new for those who are open to it. During Advent, we prepare our hearts, just like Mary herself, to receive the Christ child. The question of Advent is, are you ready to enter into your own great opening, bringing the light of Christ through you into the darkness that is so often around us? It's hard ground. It carries a cost, but it also holds out the promise of life itself, good life for you and for your neighbor, for all. It's the good news that we can share with our neighbors. Another world is possible. And again, to go back to 9/11, to go back to Iraq, to go back to the chaos, the destruction, the constant violence, and yet in the midst of that, a team of light willing to love and to care and to focus on the individual before them as made in the image of God. Ordinary people, extraordinary courage, extraordinary vision. Christ is King. Advent is coming. New birth is coming. A great new opening is coming. And today, as you take the cup and bread, I want to invite you into being accepting of the Christ who is present and not yet. The Christ who's already formed in you and wants to form deeper into you. And with the words of the Bible, be not afraid of such changes. There's nothing better than new birth. No matter the cost, there is always the rising. In faith we say, Tom Fox lives. He lives and reigns. All the martyrs, all of those we've ever known that gave us grace, they live. That's worth betting your life on.